In the late summer of 52 BC, a Roman army under the statesman and general Gaius Julius Caesar surrounded the fortified town of Alesia. This marked the beginning of the last great battle of the Gallic Wars. The siege of Alesia was characterized by an elaborate blockade consisting of a double line of fortifications with massive walls, impassable trenches, and deadly traps, built to isolate the town and starve the defenders. However, when a far superior Gallic relief army approached, it was unclear whether Caesar's ramparts, and thus his legions, would prevail. The siege of Alesia has shaped the modern perception of Roman siege warfare like no other. Many studies of siege warfare are based only on a handful of famous events, with Alesia being the most popular example by far. Caesar's reliance on a blockade at Alesia often creates the impression that extensive earthworks were an integral part of Roman siege warfare, and that the Romans relied primarily on blockades to conquer fortresses during the late Republic. However, the extent to which this was the case is questionable. To put Alesia into context, this video also examines the 29 other reasonably well-documented sieges from Caesar's time. This will reveal how important blockades and earthworks really were for Roman siege warfare. But let's start with the siege of Alesia. In 53 BC, Caesar was closer to his goal of subduing all of Gaul than ever before. He had conquered and subjugated most of the tribes between the Rhine and the Atlantic. However, when Caesar announced that Roman law would henceforth apply in Gaul, that was one step too far for the Gauls. Numerous tribes united under a chieftain of the Averni tribe, known as Vercingetorix, and rose against the occupiers. When Caesar heard about the uprising, he immediately rushed to Gaul to put it down. Vercingetorix relied on a scorched earth policy. To starve Caesar's army, he destroyed all oppida in their vicinity, along with the supplies that were stored there. Oppida, singular oppidum, is the Latin term for a fortified settlement. Nevertheless, the Romans held out and eventually conquered Avaricium, a vital supply center, by building a huge siege ramp. This solved their supply problems. Caesar then chased Vercingetorix as far as Gergovia and besieged him again, but the tide turned once more. The attack on Gergovia failed. The Romans were forced to retreat, and Vercingetorix went on the offensive. He caught up with Caesar in the Vengeance Valley. His cavalry attacked as the Romans marched off at dawn, but suffered a painful defeat at the hand of Caesar's newly recruited German mounted mercenaries. To avoid being surrounded by the Romans, Vercingetorix retreated to the nearby oppidum of Alesia. Caesar followed him. Alesia was situated on a hill between two rivers, making it easy to defend. Because Caesar wanted to avoid a repeat of the disaster at Gergovia, he decided to blockade and starve the city. His troops surrounded the town with fortified camps, and then began to encircle it with a double line of siege works. They first built a circumvallation facing inward to enclose the garrison, and then, a little later, a contravallation facing outward to protect themselves from Gallic reinforcements. The structure was complex, but if the legionaries succeeded in completing it, they had the oppidum firmly in their hands, and even an attack from the outside would not be able to change the fate of Vercingetorix and his rebels. Alesia was not the only siege where the Romans relied on a blockade and extensive earthwork. Still, the circumvallation of this oppidum is unique in its scale and clear focus on starving out the defenders. Here, the blockade was clearly the core element of Caesar's tactics. Otherwise, the Romans often relied on earthworks, but by no means always. Nevertheless, literature frequently portrays the construction of earthen entrenchments as a standard component of Roman siege warfare. Historian Josh Leviathan writes, for example, "The beginning of the siege proper is signified by communal labor." He and other historians see the construction of earthen siege work as the first step in what may have been a standard procedure for Roman sieges in the late Republic. Most people do not go quite that far. Still, even a recent standard reference for the Roman army states, quote, "To take a city, legionaries erected huge structures, describing them in a way clearly based on Caesar's circumvallation at Alesia. Such portrayals have often led to earthworks being perceived as the Roman siege method, although they were actually only used occasionally. We'll look at how often in a moment, but first, let's get back to whether the Romans succeeded in encircling Alesia and what this famous circumvallation looked like. Vercingetorix sent most of his cavalry away before the Romans closed their grip on Alesia. They were of little use in a siege and consumed a lot of food and fodder. In addition, they had an all-important task outside the walls. The horsemen informed the other tribes of what had happened and instructed them to raise a relief army. At the same time, the garrison tried to slow down the Roman work by repeatedly making small sorties, that is, by ambushing the working legionaries. These sorties yielded mixed results, but the Romans continued undiscouraged and completed the vast fortification within about a month. The inner ring was around 16 kilometers long, and the outer almost 21 kilometers long. Both consisted of a rampart with palisades and battlements, fronted by deadly obstacle fields. Anyone approaching the Romans had to cross several ditches and run the gauntlet across a wide strip of land with field fortifications, pitfalls, and tripping hazards. In addition, turrets manned by archers and slingers stood at regular intervals on the ramparts. A substantial part of these fortifications were authentically reconstructed in France as part of a museum, which also lets you experience the Gallo-Roman village of Alesia, in the form of its archaeological remains, but also reconstructed in 3D. It's well worth a visit. When traveling, whether it's to Alesia or anywhere else, I highly recommend using Saeli eSIM to stay connected and save money. Saeli offers affordable eSIM plans that cover over 200 destinations across 8 regions, ensuring you always have secure internet access wherever you go. If you've ever found yourself stranded without internet and unable to translate or navigate, you know how important it is to stay connected. Saeli has you covered, protecting you from costly roaming fees by preventing accidental connections to foreign networks. I personally save about $35 to $45 by using their 5GB plan instead of relying on my local provider. Before my trips, I simply select a plan on their website, download the app and activate it, all from the comfort of home. Saeli works both for iOS and Android devices, offers 24/7 customer support, and provides a full refund if your device isn't compatible with an eSIM. Don't wait until you're stuck with pricey roaming charges. Get an exclusive 15% discount on Saeli plans with code SandroMan at checkout. Download the app or visit saeli.com/SandroMan today. Food ran out in Alesia even before the fortifications had been completed. Despite strict rationing, Vercingetorix was forced to expel the so-called useless mouths, that is, those who could not fight. He hoped Caesar would let them pass, but the Roman general refused. Both sides shut their gates, and the desperate civilians slowly starved between the fronts. The Romans completed the outer line of fortifications just before the Gallic relief army arrived. It outnumbered Caesar's troops by quite a margin, so now the Romans themselves came under siege. The very day of their arrival, the Gallic reinforcements attacked their positions. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix tried to penetrate the inner line, so the Romans suddenly had to fight on 2 fronts. Nevertheless, they repulsed the attack. The blockade, the centerpiece of Caesar's plan, proved effective. As we have seen, the Romans repeatedly relied on blockading towns to force the defenders into surrender by isolating them, intercepting supplies, and fending off reinforcements. A quick analysis of the other sieges of Caesar's time reveals how often Roman generals relied on entrenchments, similar to those at Alesia. Out of the 29 sieges documented between 58 and 45 BC, 10 can be characterized as blockades. In the remaining 19, the primary goal was to conquer the fortress through an active attack, for example by scaling the rampart, breaking open a gate, or overrunning the defenses in an all-out assault. So this would be similar to the siege of Avaricum. The Romans, therefore, used blockades only in a third of the sieges in this period, making them a common but not universal strategy. It was somewhat more common to completely enclose a fortress or a city with fortifications, as this was sometimes also used as a precursor to other tactics, such as assaults. But even this was by no means a standard procedure. Only in around 2/5 of all the sieges did the Romans take the trouble to completely enclose a location. Overall, blockades and earthwork were likely less important than the usual examples of Roman siege warfare, particularly the siege of Alesia, suggest. But now, back to the Gallic Wars for one last time. After the Romans had repulsed the first assault, the Gauls attacked twice more. On their third attempt, they found a weak point in the outer siege line. Covered by their slingers and archers, they crossed the trenches by using wicker elements as improvised bridges. Then they fought their way through the obstacle fields. When they reached the rampart, they tried to tear down the palisades and breastworks with grappling hooks and climb up with ladders. The Roman traps and the archers on the towers claimed many lives, but the Gauls managed to break through the siege line. Only at the last moment, at least according to Caesar himself, did the Romans stop the attack. The general himself led 4 cohorts, units of 480 soldiers each, into battle, and kept the attackers busy until a reserve unit unexpectedly appeared at their back, causing the relief army to abandon the attack and flee. Knowing he could do nothing on his own, Vercingetorix also fell back. The situation was hopeless without the relief army, so he surrendered unconditionally. He was put in chains and executed in Rome 6 years later. The fall of Alesia ended the Gallic revolt, and shortly afterward, Caesar subdued the remaining tribes and Gaul became part of the Roman Empire. At Alesia, Caesar successfully relied on a double siege line, but this does not mean the Romans always entrenched the towns and fortresses they besieged. In fact, direct attacks were far more common than blockades, and entrenchments were not part of a standardized procedure that dictated the approach of Roman armies. Instead, Roman commanders tailored their actions to practical circumstances. The historian Wilhelm Willi Liebenam wrote as early as 1906, quote, "The general decides which method is the most expedient after examining the strategic situation of the terrain and the defensibility of the fortress to be conquered." He was right. Only by looking at each siege individually can we identify the chosen method. This was the case exactly 2081 years ago, on the Ides of April, 58 BC, when Caesar chose to build fortifications, blocking the Helvetii from entering Roman Gaul. This is just one example of the historical accuracy in the novel The Boar and the Eagle. Following Publius Licinius Crassus, son of the Triumvir, you'll experience the Gallic Wars from a fresh perspective. With 11 hand-drawn maps and a focus on authenticity, the historical fiction novel brings Caesar's time to life. If this piques your interest, check out the link in the description and support Jesse, who spent nearly a decade researching his book. And don't forget to complement your reading with Imperium Coffee's Caesar Roast. Perfect for history lovers, whether you prefer espresso or drip coffee. The versatile Caesar Roast stands out like the man it's named after.